Tired of using username and password for your Boundary installation? Today, we're going to talk about how you can set up OIDC authentication for your Boundary installation using Terraform. What's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter, and welcome to Terraform Tuesday. It's also Taco Tuesday, and I am 100% having some delicious chicken tacos later tonight, so I'm pretty excited about that. Today's episode is all about setting up Boundary OIDC using Azure AD with Terraform. So that's what we're going to set up. But before we get into that, I have a few quick things to cover. First of all, someone pointed out that this is my 200th video. I don't know if that's particularly important or a milestone or something you even track, but I thought it was interesting. I was like, dang, I didn't know it was that many videos. Not all Terraform videos, mind you. You can go through the back catalog and find some of the other stuff in there. But yeah, 200 videos. And along with 200 videos, I've also hit 2,000 subscribers, which is preposterous. So thank you so much if you are a subscriber. I really do appreciate every single one of you. I try to answer your comments when you bring them up, and I try to create the videos that you're interested in. And sometimes I have a back catalog that's a little ridiculous, but such is life, right? So thank you so much for subscribing if you are subscribing. If not, hey, I guess click on the subscribe button if this is your cup of tea. I certainly appreciate it. And lastly, I just want to let you know that my Terraform certification guide for the Terraform Associate Cert is currently being updated for the 1.0 general availability release. Now, there's not a ton of changes because I already kind of updated it for 0.15, but there will be a few tweaks here and there. If you buy it now, you get all the updates for free, so you can head on over to LeanPub and do that. The link is down in the description. Now let's get into today's topic. Like I said, today's topic is all about setting up Boundary OIDC using Azure AD as the authentication source, and we're going to use Terraform to set it all up. Now, let me back up a little bit because I threw a lot of terms out there, and if you haven't been watching all of my videos or keeping up to date with everything HashiCorp, you might not even know what Boundary is, which I'm surprised you watched the beginning of this video, but hey, you're here, so let me fill you in. Now, I did do a whole video around Boundary and Boundary reference architecture. I'll throw some cards up top, but just to boil things down real quick, Boundary is a product from HashiCorp. It's an open source project, so I don't even know if I would call it a product yet because you can't pay for it. But it's a project from HashiCorp, and it is meant to provide access control to resources that are behind a private network. You can think of it kind of like a Bastion host, but a lot more than just a regular Bastion host. It actually proxies the connection to whatever the target resource is, and it doesn't have to be an SSH session. It can be an HTTP call. It really can use anything that's TCP related, which is pretty cool. Now, the original version, right now, the current version is 0.3. And right, 0.3. So this is still early days. The very early versions only had one authentication method, and that was username and password. That was it. Now, obviously, that wasn't going to work for most production installs, right? You want some other authentication source. So what they decided to do was add OIDC authentication. Now, bear in mind, this is authentication and not authorization. If you're not quite sure what the difference is, authentication lets you prove you are who you say you are. Authorization determines what you're actually able to do in the application. So OIDC is meant to solve the first of those things, and you can use it for authorization sort of, but that piece is not there yet. Okay, so that's what we're going to be setting up. Now that I've covered Boundary a little bit, it's probably time to talk about OIDC. What's that thing? OIDC is a shortened version of OpenID Connect, and it's a way to take any web application and set it up to talk to some authentication source in an open way. And it makes use of the OAuth 2 protocol to do that. So that's what it is in a nutshell. Now, the source for your authentication can be anything that supports OpenID Connect, and there's a bunch of different services that do support it. On the tutorial that's on the current Learn HashiCorp site for Boundary, they walk you through the process of setting up OIDC for Boundary using Okta and Auth0. So those are two third-party platforms that do identity as a service. But you can also use any of the cloud providers, really, because they all, as far as I know, support OpenID Connect in different ways. The Azure version of that is Azure Active Directory, and so you can create a connection to Azure AD that Boundary can use, and then users can authenticate using their account in Azure AD, and then that authentication is trusted by Boundary. So let me walk you through the process by which a user authenticates using OpenID Connect. It all starts with going to the application itself. So in this case, we'd go directly to the Boundary portal. Once we're there, we're going to select an authentication method, or they may already be one selected for you if you have a primary setup. In our case, we'd be using Azure AD. So we will click on Authenticate via Azure AD, and that is going to redirect us to a page in Azure AD that allows us to authenticate using our Azure Active Directory account. Once we have successfully authenticated through the standard Azure AD flow, then Azure AD knows to now send that authentication using a redirect back to the application that originally invoked it. So you get sent back to the Boundary login page, but this time you've got a JWT with you, which is a JSON Web Token. I think that's what it stands for. A JWT, I've heard it called. I'm from Philly, so it's like a John. It's like a JWT, you know? So that's what you get sent back. And then in the background, Boundary validates that the JWT that you have lines up with what it expects from Azure AD. And if it all lines up, it lets you into Boundary. And that doesn't mean you can do anything yet. It just authenticates you. Now there's a whole separate authorization piece where you might associate a user with a role. And we'll get to that in the demonstration. But that's basically what it does in a nutshell. Now there's two things that need to be set. One on the Boundary side in the authentication method, and the other on the Azure AD side. On the Boundary side, it needs to know where to send authentication requests. And that's going to be a unique URL based off of the tenant where those Azure AD accounts are. So that's a link that we're going to have to create and feed to Boundary when we configure our authentication method. And over on the Azure AD side, you have to create what's called a web application in Azure AD in the tenant where you're going to be doing the authentication, and then create a service principal, which is kind of like a service account that's associated with that web application. And then you'll generate credentials that Boundary can use to use that service principal. Now, in the properties of that web application on Azure AD, you tell it, what's the reply address? Where do I send the successful authentications back to once I'm done my job? And that is usually called the redirect URL or the reply URL. It depends on what service you're using, but basically you're telling Azure AD, once that authentication is complete, send it back to this URL, which would be the public URL of the Boundary service. So those are the two settings we have to configure and some of the objects we have to create within Azure AD. And we also have to create the authentication method within Boundary. Those are the things that we're going to set up using Terraform. So let's get into the demonstration with no further ado and set up everything using Terraform. All right, here we are in Visual Studio Code where I've got the files open for our Boundary example. They're right here in the Boundary OIDC folder. If you're looking for these files, you can always find them on my GitHub repository. It's ned1313/Terraform Tuesdays. And I'm going to rename this folder to today's date. So it'll be 2021-06-15. So if you're looking for it, that's where it's going to be. And I got the example files in here. Now, under new commands, because I originally did this just using the Azure AD CLI to try it out, under new commands, these are the commands we're actually going to run. Make sure you're on Boundary 0.2.3 at least, because that's what we're going to need. And remember, we're going to set up a few things here. We're going to set up the authentication method within Boundary, and we're going to set up the web application and the service principal in Azure AD. So those are the two things we're going to set up. All right, now with that in mind, we first need to get an instance of Boundary running. And rather than spin this whole thing up in Azure or somewhere else, we're just gonna run a local development instance of Boundary. And the way that we do that is by running Boundary dev. And then because of the way that the reply URL is restricted within Azure, If you want to set it up for local, if you want to set it up for a local address, you have to use localhost. You can't use 127.0.0.1. So I set the API listen address to localhost port 9200 and the host address to localhost. So that's what Boundary is listening on when the reply comes back from Azure AD. That's something I had to figure out after a little bit of trial and error. So let's start by grabbing this command. We'll copy it and we'll run it down here. There we go. And once that is up and running, I do want to point out one thing. You need Docker Desktop installed in order to run this because it actually spins up Postgres in a container on Docker. So if you don't have that, Boundary Dev, it's not going to work so great for you. So just, bear that in mind. That's another prerequisite you have to have in place. All right. Now, if we want to authenticate to Boundary, right now, the only enabled method is the username and password authentication method. So let's go to a second terminal window we've got right here, and we're going to run Boundary authenticate, and the authentication method type is password. The authentication method for the password that's automatically generated for the dev is this AMPUW. So AM authentication method, PW password _ 12345678990. So that's going to be the same whenever you spin up a dev instance. And then the login name is admin and the password is password. So we'll go ahead and authenticate to Boundary first. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and type in password. There we go. We have now successfully authenticated to our Boundary server, which means that Terraform can use that authentication to make configuration changes to the Boundary instance. Now I've already logged into my Azure AD tenant and selected the proper account where I want to create resources. So that's all done. The next step is to run the Terraform configurations. But before we do that, let's take a look at what's actually in those Terraform configurations. And we will start by looking at what is in this OIDC auth method.tf file. So in this auth method file, first we have to define the provider for Boundary. And for this, I actually have the auth method ID, the password, and the login name all hard-coded in here because it is using the dev instance. This is always going to be the same. If you are doing this on like an Azure instance or anywhere else you've deployed Boundary, you're going to have to update this provider, and you can use environment variables for all of these settings. Next, I invoke a module, Azure OIDC, that will set up all the resources I need in Azure. Now, within Boundary, it has this idea of different scopes. So you can create multiple organizations in the same Boundary instance and create sort of a multi-tenant structure. We're going to create an organization, and we're going to set the authentication method we're creating as the primary for that organization. So here we're creating organization 1. Now, the next thing to do is create that authentication method. And so we set the scope to the organization that we just created. The issuer is going to be the URL where we're going to send our authentication requests in Azure AD. And that is going to be login.microsoftonline.com and then / the tenant ID of the tenant where we want to do the authentication / v2.0. That is what the issuer URL is. And then for the client ID and client secret, that is based off of the service principal that we're going to create inside our Azure OIDC module. The callback URL is defined by the Boundary server, v1 auth methods, OIDC authenticate callback. Now, by default, it should use whatever you've set for the host address and API address when you spin up the dev server. But I've explicitly set it here anyway because there was a little weirdness on previous versions of Boundary where it would kind of default to 127.0.0.1, and that would break things. So I just have it hard-coded in here. And then signing algorithm is set to RS-256, which is what's required by Azure. The API URL prefix is the Boundary server. We're calling this authentication method Azure AD. And we're setting it as the primary for the scope for this. So when we go to this organization we've created, it's going to force us to use Azure AD as our primary authentication method. Now, let's go ahead and look at what's in our Azure OIDC module. Within the Azure OIDC module, we've got two files here. We've got Azure AD and we've got Terraform.tf. Terraform.tf just defines the required providers, so nothing really exciting in here. Azure AD is where we create all of our resources. The first thing we're going to do is set a variable, which is the reply URL. And this is set to a default of localhost 9200, but you can override that if you're running Boundary in a non-dev instance. Now, we need to get a Graph API ID from the Microsoft Graph. So we're basically using a data source to get the Azure AD service principal called Microsoft Graph. And then we also have to get the tenant ID because we're going to use the tenant ID when we configure the authentication method for Boundary in the previous configuration that we just looked at. And then I'm going to generate a random number for naming things because it's just kind of easier to do that. Now, this one thing here, the OAuth to permissions scope could be a little confusing. There is a scope, and the scope value is defined inside information that's returned by that Azure AD Service Principal data source. I don't want to go into full details. It was a little confusing to figure out what's going on here, but basically we have to get the auth to permissions scope for the Microsoft Graph, and we specifically have to get the scope value. So we can extract that value by using the data source and then running this for loop to just grab that value out, and it'll grab all of the relevant scopes and put them into that local value. And then we have a read all scope where we look up in the scopes, find me the scope that matches group member read all. So basically what we're doing here is we're granting the service principal permissions to read all of the group membership within our Azure AD tenant. And that will be important later when we want to apply authorization as well as authentication to our Azure AD OIDC. Then lastly, we have to give an app name for the web app we're creating. So I'm going to call it Boundary and then the random number that we created earlier. Okay, so that's all set with locals. Now we're going to create our application in Azure AD. We'll give it the display name that I just set. And under required resource access, this is where we use some of the information that we've extracted before. The resource app ID is going to be from that data source for the Microsoft Graph. That's going to be the ID. And then the resource access is that value that we extracted using read all scope. That's going to give us the group member read all permissions to the Microsoft Graph specifically for our tenant. So that's basically giving the Azure AD application some permissions to access resources. And then under the web block in here, that's where we specify the redirect URL. This is how it sends information back to Boundary when the authentication is complete. So that all goes into the Azure AD web application. If we scroll down a little bit more, we get into the service principal creation. So this sets up the credentials Boundary is going to use for OIDC against Azure AD. So we simply have to create a service principal and associate it with the application we've just created. Then we're going to create a password to associate with our service principal. So we'll use the random password resource. And then lastly, we'll set the password for the service principal we just created using the value we just generated. And then I have a set of outputs that are used by the configuration that we looked at before, the root module, which includes the tenant ID, the client ID, and the client secret. And then lastly, there's a fun output here. There's one thing that Terraform can't do in this process, which is actually to officially grant the permissions that you set up for the Azure AD application, but you can do it using an Azure CLI command. So I output that command after the Terraform apply is complete so that you can apply it and actually grant it the permissions that we've set up for the Azure AD application. So let's go ahead and run through our Terraform apply process. All right, we've gone through the full configuration. Let's go back to new commands. And obviously we will need to run Terraform init. I believe I've already run it, but you know what? There's no harm in running it again. So we'll go ahead and run Terraform init. That'll take care of the providers and the modules. And then all we have to do is run Terraform apply -auto approve. I'll go ahead and run that. I'm not going to bother with plan. Now, you might wonder why I'm not running this using a remote state backend as I've been doing with previous ones. Well, I could do that, but especially if I'm going to use Terraform Cloud, then it runs the commands remotely, and those remote runners don't have access to my dev instance of Boundary, so it actually wouldn't work doing it that way. So I know generally I'm trying to use remote runners and Terraform Cloud wherever I can, but it didn't really work for this specific situation. All right, now the creation process should go relatively quickly because it's not actually spinning up any resources. It's just creating things in Azure AD. So we should see this complete in a moment. All right, and it finished, and it parsed out that grant command that we have to run to grant the permissions. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that and run it down here. There we go. And now we've officially granted those permissions to the web application. Everything should be all ready. So all we have to do is go to a browser, enter the localhost 9200 address to access our Boundary instance. So let's go over to a browser and do that now. All right, here I am at the login page for Boundary. And let's go ahead and choose the organization that we created, Organization 1. And you can see once we select Organization 1, the only authentication option we have is Azure AD. So I'll go ahead and click Authenticate here, and you see it redirects me to Azure AD and gives me a list of accounts I can pick from. I'll go ahead and pick my Azure AD account that I know is in the tenant that I configured. My authentication process is successful, and I get redirected back to localhost in the relevant scope. Now remember, I didn't give myself permissions to do anything in Boundary. I'm simply authenticated to this one organization. So I have no access to other organizations. And if I go to something like, say, roles, I am not authorized under projects. There are no projects, but if there were, I'm not authorized to view them. But I have created at least a user for myself, which I can't view either. The only thing I can see is the authentication method, and that's because I need read access to use it. So let's go ahead and we're going to log out as the Azure AD user. We'll pick the global scope and we'll log in as the administrator. So admin, password. All right, now we're logged in as the admin. We can go into Organization 1, and once again, we can review the auth methods. If we go to users, we can see the user that was generated. When I authenticated using Azure AD, it automatically created a user within Boundary. And if we look at that user, under accounts, there's now an account associated with my user, which links back to my Azure AD account. Now you might wonder where that name comes from, and if you can map it so you can create the users ahead of time and associate them with roles and all that kind of stuff. Well, it turns out that this is actually a pairwise value that's automatically generated by Azure AD, and you can't predict what it's going to be. So something that's coming down the pike that's available in Boundary but not in the Terraform provider yet is the ability to map your username, say your service principal or UPN, user principal name, to a user within Boundary using claims mapping in OIDC. And that's something that I will demonstrate in a different video. But basically then you'll be able to pre-create all the users that you want in your organization on Boundary and then map all of those users to users that exist in Azure AD. It's something that people absolutely want. It's not there yet. But we do have an account, we do have a user, and if we go to roles, we can go into administration and go to principals and go to manage, add a principal. We can add the user that was automatically generated, and now my user in Boundary, which is linked to my account in Azure AD, should have admin access to this specific organization. So if I go ahead and de-authenticate, and I'll pick the Organization 1 scope and click on Authenticate and go through the same authentication process once again. I've now successfully authenticated. I'm back in the organization. It's still the only organization I have access to. But if I go down to something like roles, I can now view roles, I can view groups, and I can view users. So now I have full admin access to just this organization. So that's the process of setting up authorization on top of authentication today. In a later instance, you'll be able to create group mappings where a group in Azure AD or group membership in Azure AD could map to role assignments within Boundary. So not only can you pre-create the users and map them, you can pre-configure their authorization via a role once they're logged in. So all of that could be pretty automatic and seamless for the end user. So that's going to do it for this demonstration. All right, in this video, we used Terraform to set up OIDC authentication with Azure AD against Boundary in a dev instance. And it was a lot of information, so if you want to watch back through or just walk through it yourself, I definitely recommend doing that. You'll learn a lot about Boundary and Terraform by just figuring out what I'm doing in the configuration and walking it through yourself. So highly recommended that you go ahead and do that. That's going to do it for me for Terraform Tuesday. As always, thank you so much for watching. You know, I really do appreciate every single one of you, all 2,000 of you. I can't believe that. That's just, oh, it's kind of mind-blowing, right? I'm just some schmo who puts Terraform videos on YouTube, and y'all have subscribed, and I really do appreciate that. So thank you. You know, leave comments. Feel free to interact. You can find me on Twitter. It's Ned1313. If you feel like supporting the show, that would be fantastic. I do have a Patreon, and you can sign up for as little as $2 if that's your thing. You can go up to $5 and get your name in the credits, or even go up to $15 and be a big burrito. That is entirely up to you. If you do sign up, you get access to a newsletter, and I'm trying to get these videos out a little bit earlier so you get early access to the videos. After I think I take a vacation at the end of this month, I'll be able to reset and catch up on that. So you will get early access to videos once I catch up to myself. If that's not your thing, I totally understand. If you want to subscribe to the channel, that's very much appreciated. And if you want to share with a friend, I appreciate that too. So virtual hugs right through the mic. There you go. All right. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay healthy, stay safe out there. Bye for now. All right, this is a weird one. This is another thing that I found in my garage at my parents' house. It's this. Does anybody know this book? Have you ever seen this before? I bought this in a Hot Topic in like 97 or something. It's Revelation X, the Bob Apocryphon. I think it was, I either bought it there or I bought it at a Borders Books. It's one of the two. I know, how like 97 can you get? I bought it at a Borders book. It was an incredibly weird book, or is an incredibly weird book with a weird made-up religion, but entertaining reading nonetheless. So if you know what I'm talking about, leave something in the comments, because I have barely ever run into someone who knows anything about this weird book. So once again, this is the book by J.R. Bob Dobbs. Anyway, that's going to do it for me. Bye.